Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize to you and to our panel members for being late. Coming in, just listening to you, Ms. Riddell, when you were talking about a little bit of the international component. When we're looking over into the Middle East, the threat of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, the threat, obviously, that concerns many of us, that places to Israel and then to world stability in terms of oil supply. You were commenting accurately that this is a world market, a commodity for oil. Is it your estimation, given the challenges we see in the Middle East, that even if the price is driven by an international market, that it is in the best interests of the United States of America to be developing our own energy resources right here rather than relying on foreign markets to be able to deliver our oil? And part of the reason I say that is I was a little disturbed when the President, through the World Import-Export Bank, guaranteed a $2 billion loan to Brazil to be able to drill off of their shores and say we want to be one of their best customers. Would it be more sensible for us to be drilling on American soil, creating American jobs, and developing American energy certainty?
I absolutely agree that, domestic energy production is a huge component to, not only our national security, but also our jobs. As Mr. Squillace said, the natural gas production is more of a domestic commodity. I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to make that transition from such a oil-dependent nation to start moving into different areas, i.e. natural gas, where we have trillions of cubic feet of undeveloped natural gas in this country. Unfortunately, when the divergence of the oil and gas prices happened, not a lot of folks, you cannot drill economically. So unless oil companies would like to volunteer their time and money, you're not going to see as much natural gas production. However, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to transition a lot of our baseload power to natural gas, some of our fleets to natural gas, and eventually maybe some of our own cars to natural gas. But every time you do that transition, you do fight higher prices. And for the average American, buying a car is expensive enough, but if you have to make a decision as to buy, an oil-based car or a natural gas-based car and the price difference is $15,000, it's not a hard decision for most Americans to make. So I absolutely think it's important. I think we can make a huge transition. I also think we can start to ensure more of our security if we responsibly develop these resources domestically.
I appreciate that. And I think one thing we need to keep a focus on is American jobs. In your testimony, you were talking about over in Garfield County. And this past weekend, I happened to be in Rifle, Silt, Glenwood, an area that's has lower unemployment typically, but if you drive a little bit further west into Mesa County, we see effectively double-digit unemployment that is there. So when we are talking about creating American energy certainty for our future and our security, and all of you may want to chime in on this when it gets down to actually being able to create jobs, good-paying jobs. And I can speak with confidence. I've dealt with and have folks that I've talked to that actually have dirt under their fingernails, that love the area. They want to make sure that it's done responsibly. But what kind of a role can this positive development actually play in terms of getting America back to work? Mr. Barber?
Mr. Tipton, thank you. It's a great question that sets up a thought, I think. There are some that think that the market for oil will be what it will be regardless of what we produce here in these United States. And although I don't know that that's true, let's say for a moment that it is. We have an opportunity to produce federally owned minerals that, by the way, $1 out of every 8 that is produced, the value of those minerals goes back to the Federal Government. So right away there is a 1/8 partner in those wells, if you will, that is the Federal Government. They split those royalties with the states that it's produced in. 52-48%, I think, is the split. But if we're going to get $100 a barrel for oil, we're going to pay $100 a barrel for oil regardless of who we buy it from, if that's the situation. It seems tremendously valuable to me to do it in a fashion that, first of all, 1/8 of those dollars go back to the Federal Government. If we buy it from somewhere else, none of those dollars go to the Federal Government. And then we can look at what does the rest of that $100 come. Well, it comes from things like the money that goes to the local drilling company, the local roustabout crew, the local permitting company, the roustabout employees, hotels, retail, just a vast group of folks that when $9 or $10 million is spent drilling a horizontal shale well, that share in those prices that are out there for those services. If we give that up, all of those monies that are paid for those services go elsewhere. And I also worry that the other thing that can go elsewhere is the investment dollars of the companies that are willing to drill here but can't.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, were you going to have a second round? Okay. You know, one thing I think that I think would be a little interesting here, and Mr. Scalacci, sorry, on that I'd kind of like to have you comment on. The Colorado State Legislature recently passed a resolution. It was 12-1004 that they passed on to the to the BLM. In the resolution, it called on the BLM to revise its current restrictive resource plan in Colorado in order to increase oil and natural gas production in Colorado. Was the state legislature wrong to be able to put that sort of a resolution forward with bipartisan support?
You know, of course, the nature of the resolution is such that it's a question of degree, and what is too restrictive or what is not restrictive enough, I think, is a matter of that people can have differing opinions about. I think it's certainly true that we need to encourage domestic energy development. I'm not opposed to doing that. The concern, I think, is, and one of the concerns relating to your earlier question, is just that we not get into a situation which we've seen so often in the Western United States of boom and bust kind of development cycles. We need a steady kind of process for development, and too often the exuberance of higher prices at one moment leads us to go beyond perhaps where we should go with development and leads to then a bust cycle, which is, I think, more detrimental than if we're able to do these things in a steady way. So I think that is the sort of difficult balance to try to find here. How can we have sort of steady development that achieves growth in jobs, that employs people, that is good for our local economy and for our national economy as well, without overdoing it? And that's the temptation. It's a very difficult kind of thing. There's a lot of pressure to move towards overdevelopment, but I think if we learn from the past, we'll know that there are limits to how far we ought to go in this direction. You
know, I'm concerned about that very thing as well when we're looking at you're a Coloradoan
Yes.
as well. When we look in Colorado, federal leases dropped, which I find shocking because the President's talking about putting Americans back to work and we aren't creating the opportunity. We turned down the Keystone Pipeline, 20-plus thousand jobs directly, 100,000 indirect that we could have created here in America. We look at our state, my congressional district, where we have people that are suffering right now, not only with high gas prices, but just worried about being able to keep a roof over their head right now. Colorado federal leases dropped, contrary to what the President is trying to purport right now, that we're increasing production, but leases dropped from 320 in 2008 to 11 in 2011. So are we seeing restrictive policies out of this administration when it comes to some of our public lands? And again, let's underscore, we want to be able to do it responsibly. But we also want to be able to feed our children. We want our people to be able to work.
I think that's a very fair question, and we've discussed this a little bit before about how the drop in the price of natural gas has really affected interest in federal leasing. Now, it's not the only factor, and I don't want to suggest to you that that's the only thing that's going on here. But there's no doubt when natural gas drops below $3 a thousand cubic feet, there are significant economic reasons why the industry is not particularly interested in developing those leases and bidding on them. It's a very cyclical kind of thing. Natural gas in the United States is actually up significantly, largely because of some of the domestic supplies that are being found in the eastern part of the United States from the big shale plays out there. So I'm not suggesting that there's nothing to the point that you're making. I would note that I believe the director of the BLM recently testified that about a quarter of the leases that the BLM has offered in the past few years have gone without any bids on them. So parcels have been nominated by industry and they're offered for lease and they're not bid upon. And so it may just be what's happening with the market, and I don't think we should read too much into the fact that the current level of leasing is down.
Okay. And I'll be happy, we ought to certainly talk about this because I'm talking to companies that are having leases held up. You know, it's up to 10 years, well, 9 years I think is the high mark to be able to actually develop and be able to go to production. Which I think greatly creates that boom and bust cycle that you're talking about because time is money when it gets down to business and development and the tremendous capital investment that it takes to be able to develop some of these resources that are out there. I'd just kind of like to open this up a little bit, maybe if I don't want to overstretch, Mr. Chairman, in terms of time here. But
Mr. West, do you have any additional questions? I'm good.
Great. I'll just kind of wrap it. Can you give us any examples, and this may be open to the whole panel here, where the President's domestic or foreign policies have contributed to really what we're seeing at the pump? You know, we're seeing increased costs that are going on. The President talks about an all-of-the-above energy policy, but it's a matter really in terms of the tax code of picking winners and losers, which he abhors on one hand and embraces on the other. You know, I think our colleagues, at least on the Republican side, we need to have tax reform. It needs to be flatter, fairer, and simpler. But right now we're seeing an administration policy that seems to be pretty convoluted in terms of the real impacts on the American people. And just give me some of your comments, if you would, in terms of the administration policies. Yes, sir. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Tipton. When one considers the size of the companies that are sort of represented and being discussed here, they're generally smaller production companies. And we, like someone else who sells their product on a market, we could be just like a wheat farmer. The individual wheat farmer doesn't get to determine what it is that they receive for their commodity. They grow it and choose to sell it or put it in a granary and sell it maybe when markets are different. So one of the things that maybe we don't have the ability to do in our positions is to determine what it is we get for that product. Because if we could, I'm sure we would want to get more for the price of natural gas right now. Natural gas is being there's certainly plenty of supply, and in some cases operators are out there shutting in wells to not produce at the current pricing. I think in terms of liquids, there may be situations where it would be better to be able to have a predictable price of some number that is survivable for companies, but certainly that type of marketing is beyond the scope of smaller companies.
I'd just like to make a comment on that. I think that, as I said, I do not get involved in that gas play, but I'm certainly conversant with it. I watched the oil plays in Texas in similar types of environment, and that turned out that many of those, the operator was the The guy that controlled the acreage initially and turned it to somebody was the only guy that made a lot of money on it. In the Austin Chalk play down there, you were lucky if you were getting 2-to-1 return on the investment. If you got a dry hole on the way, your investors were very fortunate if they ever got their money back. What I think is going to happen in the gas play is that it's a similar type of play in that the return on investment is not very big. Yes, you can get a well every time, so from a promoter standpoint, it's great. But what's going to happen is that all of these little guys that jumped in, and I mentioned a while ago that got burned, they'll turn their acreage. It's all going to be bought up by the majors, at which point the majors will have the option of slowing down drilling so that they can get the price back up. Now, why would they do that? Right now, when you bring in one of those wells, they look great on initial potential, but very quickly those things dive. And in order to keep the investors happy, you have to start drilling another well very quickly to get another good well that will also dive, so that it's what I have called the black hole of drilling. I know that's putting a bad slant on it, but because I'm not interested in it in the first place, I can't afford it. But that's what's going to happen at the point in time when the majors get sufficient control of all of those acres. They will then just gradually slow down on their drilling, and the price of gas, they'll get the price of gas to edge up again. Prediction.
Thank you, Mr. Tipton. I think for most of us, we are looking for simpler tax reform. However, I do know that the President is currently talking about removing the intangible drilling cost deduction that the oil and natural gas industry can take, in addition to not allowing the depletion rates, deduction on depletion rates. And these are very frightening to smaller independents. These affect, these are not off, these aren't give-me's. These are standard manufacturing deductions that any manufacturing company would be able to get. These are sunk costs. This is the cost of doing business. If he takes away these deductions from the oil and natural gas industry, it could cause a 25% loss in capital reinvestment, which then just basically turns around into loss of jobs and loss of domestic energy production, because companies will not be able to, smaller companies will not be able to operate under these stipulations. In addition, we hear a lot about the $1 billion that the majors make, and although these profits may sound excessive, sometimes these are only a 6% rate of return for even the larger companies. So these are not, what needs to be looked at is not the overall figure, because these are large, international companies, but what really needs to be looked at is the individual rate of return, sometimes as low as 6%. So some of the proposed tax reforms will and can put a lot of the smaller independents just completely out of business.
I think we can all agree that a simpler tax code would be a good thing. I doubt that many Americans would disagree with that point. The devil, of course, is in the details. But I'd like to focus more specifically on the relevance of your comment to energy policy. And here, I hope that we can agree that we need to take the long view. Now, where our energy policy will be, or where our mix of energy will be in 2050 may be a subject of disagreement. But the key point here is that we ought not try to have an energy policy just for the moment. I mean, we know that the economy is down right now. People need jobs, and in the short term, we need to deal with those kinds of issues. But we also need, as a matter of planning, to think about where we want our energy policy to go. And I hope as the Congress is thinking about these broad issues about energy policy, that they will look at the big picture and look at the long term and try to adopt policies that will get us where we need to be in 30, 40, and even 50 years from now. I think that is really key. And if we can reach some kind of agreement about where we need to go, I think we can see a clearer path for us to get there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.